After the Philippines fell to the Japanese, a few of the American officers, now prisoners, were able to talk about their battles, and given their circumstances, there was no reason to hold back. Brigadier General Clifford Blumell, commander of the 31st Division, spoke to Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, who gave his view of the entire war for the Philippines. Quote, "Our units were doomed before they started to fight. They never had a chance to win. That they lasted as long as they did is a stirring and touching tribute to their gallantry and fortitude." Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 314, The Battle of Bataan. Setting the stage, as defensive grounds went, Bataan was actually one of the best. After all, the peninsula only had two main north-south roads, one on each coast, though the one to the east had more relatively flat land, hence that coast had to be watched closely. As for the peninsula itself, Bataan is about 25 miles long and 15 miles wide. However, all that was dominated by several mountain ranges, again, all to the good for the defenders, as the heights narrowed, literally, the approaches to the island of Corregidor, just below the peninsula. As for the terrain, the word jungle does not even begin to do it justice. The thick foliage blocks out the wind and most of the sun, leaving the air under the canopy perpetually damp. Added to this, the humidity never gets below 75%, and that is during the dry season. And with the temperature normally over 100 degrees, to not be standing out in the open, pretty much along one of the coasts, is to stand and fight in nature's own sauna. In the upper left-hand corner of the peninsula, from the Allied point of view, is Mount Selanganan, and just to its left, along the coast, is the town of Malbon, on which the West Road passes through. But it was Mount Natib, in the center of the northernmost Allied position and defensive line, that MacArthur was counting on. In fact, as Natib was so daunting, its peak was 4,222 feet above sea level, there would be no defending troops placed on it. Rather, a defensive line would be to either side of it. The third mountain range, the Mariveles Mountains, was to the south of Mount Natib, but not quite at the bottom of the peninsula. As MacArthur would break up the peninsula in two defensive commands, the dividing line, running roughly down the middle of the peninsula, would stop at the Mariveles. Below that, as it was the end of the peninsula, which was to shield Corregidor, that was the joint security area, and thus the responsibility of all. As for all else on the peninsula, it was covered, again, in jungle, benefiting the defenders and hampering the movement of the attacking enemy. Indeed, as General Homma had to switch out his very much missed 48th Division for the inexperienced 65th Independent Mixed Brigade, this time was used by the defenders to strengthen their positions even further. Despite all this, Lieutenant General Nara, the commander of the 65th, had confidence in the mobilized reservists, who were, on paper, only fit for occupation duty after the battle had been won. But now for the negatives. MacArthur's troops, positioned all on the northern half of Bataan, had limited supplies of food, medicine, and weapons. As such, MacArthur had put his troops on half rations starting on January 5th. Speaking of his troops, many more made it to Bataan than thought possible, and that was both good and bad. Good for defense, bad considering the lack of supplies. During the battles that had defended Manila, the General Staff believed that about 43,000 troops would be able to reach the peninsula. In reality, there were now some 80,000 Filipino and American troops, and 26,000 civilians who could not be ignored. As previously covered, the overall defensive plan had been made up years ago, being a part of Plan Orange. MacArthur just had to put men into positions of command. And as the Japanese would find out, having had years to work this defense out, not to mention days of plotting locations for the artillery units, the defenders would be more ready than anticipated. MacArthur divided his forces into two corps. The western half of the peninsula would be defended by the 1st Philippine Corps, comprising 22,500 troops, and led by General Jonathan Wainwright. Under him would be the Philippine 1st, 31st, 71st, and 91st Divisions, along with the, believe it or not, still viable 26th Cavalry Regiment. The eastern half would be protected by the 2nd Philippine Corps, led by Major General George Parker, Jr. He would have 25,000 troops of the Philippine 11th, 21st, 41st, and 51st Divisions, along with the 57th Infantry Regiment from the Philippine Division. About 8 miles south or below the main battle line, MacArthur set up a rear position that stretched across the peninsula from Bagak on the west coast to Orion on the east. This line was anchored by Mount Samat, yes, another height, that the enemy would hopefully not want to deal with. Of course, a pessimist would say that if the enemy got past this line, there went Bataan. And they would be right. Behind this line, comprising the southern coast, was the Allies' service area that would supply the two corps with supplies and medical needs. Of course, this area could be attacked directly by the Japanese with amphibious landings. So, to protect the area, the Philippine Constabulary, the 4th Marines, and the personnel from the former Air Force and Navy would be stationed here. Keeping it simple, always the best way to go in terms of combat, MacArthur's idea was to conduct a defense in depth, and this was the best, if unimaginative, way to go. Use the cumbersome terrain to hold the enemy at bay until help arrived, all the while inflicting casualties. And Plan Orange was constructed around the idea that help should arrive in about 6 months. Not that the Allies had that much food, but sometimes it's best to leave tomorrow's problems until tomorrow. Further, MacArthur expected General Homma to send his attack down the east coast of Bataan, as it offered a wider area for maneuverability, and as Route 110, the East Road, was connected with Route 7 just above the peninsula, it was the most direct route. As for the West Road, there was no road that connected it with where the Japanese were currently. Thus, a trek through the jungle would be needed, which would take time. Having taken a few days to get reorganized, General Homma now told his men the attack would commence with all its imperfections, i.e., many supplies were still in central Luzon, the men were inexperienced, Nara was not the best combat commander, and lastly, the troops of the 65th Brigade were past the peak age to fight. But it didn't have to be this way, the taking of the capital only to then have to destroy the enemy, taking more time and costing more lives. The Japanese Empire had learned much from the West since Commodore Matthew Perry barged his way into Tokyo Bay in 1853. And one lesson learned was modern warfare, particularly from the Prussians and Karl von Clausewitz's book, Come Bible, on war. Simply stated, not that Clausewitz ever said anything simply, was that in war, the purpose of one's army is to take the capital and destroy the enemy's forces. Normally, this could be wrapped up into one, as an enemy force would fight to the death to defend its capital. So, since 1919, the Japanese General Staff, in making their plans to conquer the Philippines, planned on taking Manila, then finish off the American forces who would be leading the Filipino troops before they could take up a defensive position somewhere on Luzon, probably on Bataan, as it was the perfect place for such an action. But that is not what had happened here. Manila had been abandoned. It was indefensible, and the defenders had been able to get away to Bataan. The one man who saw this years before it happened and tried to prevent it was Lieutenant General Masami Maeda, Homma's chief of staff. Back in 1925, the Army had sent Maeda to the Philippines to spy and bring back vital information. From that moment on, the young man was convinced if war came to the islands, the defenders would avoid a decisive battle, abandon Manila, and withdraw to Bataan. Fast forward to the eve of the Empire's attack in Southeast Asia, Maeda was summoned to Army headquarters. Again, he tried to get the men of the General Staff to understand that when it came to Luzon, Clausewitz was wrong. It was more important to wipe out the forces first, then take Manila, as there would be no one to stop them. He ended his plea with, "What is the main objective here, gentlemen? After all, to take the capital or destroy the enemy?" But in the end, no one on that staff had the courage to analyze that question too closely or dared to contest the idea of the dead Prussian officer and theorist. Sometime later, as Homma's commanders were pushing ever closer to Manila, Maeda was still trying, visiting each one he could to get someone to turn their men to block access to the peninsula, but all for naught. Still, Manila fell 12 days after the main landing on December 22nd, and in response, the New York Times wrote, "This country now drinks the unaccustomed and bitter drought of defeat, and no reassuring explanation can ease the blow." Yet it was Maeda that recognized that his country's flag flying over the capital was a political victory. First and foremost, the enemy's forces were still free. Only then did Homma and his lieutenants catch up to Maeda. Quote, "We had the opportunity to pound them, and instead we allowed them to flee. So this is what it means to miss a big prize." Unquote. Not that this meant there wasn't a titanic clash of opinions among Homma's officers, even at this point, what to do. Some said there will be 50,000 enemy troops waiting for us, dug in rough terrain. However, they are low on food, so let's bottle them up and wait them out. But the other officer said, "No, they are defeated, broken, weak. Let's attack and end this." Yet it wasn't Homma's staff or Homma himself that made the decision. For in the middle of this argument came a telegram from Tokyo that read, "Send a report on how you expect to proceed with Bataan operations. The information is needed to make a report to the throne." And that was that. The attack would proceed. However, as previously covered, just as Homma was about to move forward with his attack, he was told by Southern Army headquarters that the war in the Southwest Pacific was going so well, it had been decided to move forward the attack on Java, which meant needing the 48th Division earlier than planned. So, just like that, Homma was about to lose almost half of his command and his best soldiers to boot. Replacing them would be the recently arrived 65th Brigade, a rear echelon unit that was so unprepared for combat that half of its men did not have rifles. Even the 65th's commander, Lieutenant General Akira Nara, said the organization was absolutely unfit for combat. However, General Nara was not as unprepared as his men, having studied American infantry doctrine at Fort Benning, Georgia, to then go on to teach the tactics of attacking fortified positions at the Imperial Army War College in Tokyo. He knew the mission before his men was impossible. But like Homma, he would do as he was told, without complaint. On the way out the door, the 48th Division Commander, Lieutenant General Tsuji Hashi, told Nara, "I must tell you that you will be making a huge miscalculation if you think those old soldiers of yours, and a few supplies you have, will be able to easily defeat the Americans and Filipinos." Nara replied the way he was expected to, by saying, "Oh well, never mind, soon we will all be celebrating this victory." After that, the 65th Brigade walked the 137 miles from Lingayen Gulf to just above the Bataan Peninsula, a walk that almost did a lot of the older soldiers in. But the worst of it for them was still in their future, certainly as it was made clear to Nara that he should attack right away. On the evening of January 7th, the first units of the 65th Brigade arrived at Pampanga Province, an area about 15 miles northeast of the top of Bataan, and waiting for them and General Nara was an aide to General Homma, a Colonel Motu Nakayama. He only had one thing to say: "The general wants you to attack now." Nara replied to this, "Attack where?" For Nara did not know exactly where the enemy was, or how their dispositions were laid out, and where their reserve forces were, always a concern. Plus, there was no up-to-date reconnaissance information. To all this, Nara said, "We do control the skies. Let's take some aerial photos and make plans." To which Nakayama said, again, "No, you should attack immediately. It will be easy. Just form up and march, either along the coast road or into the jungle. Either way, eventually you'll run into the enemy, and then you fight." Nara knew it was to be the same as during the war with Russia in 1904, where almost 90,000 Hohei, or steppe soldiers, for the infantry walked everywhere, had died by simply charging into the enemy's fortified guns at Port Arthur. Nara, the tactician, knew this was beyond stupid, but an order was an order. As Nara lined up his men, he did not know, again, little to no intelligence had been gathered, that his force, augmented to 13,000 troops, was about to go up against 47,500 frontline Filipino troops, with thousands more in reserve and American troops at their side. On January 9th, at 3 p.m., Nara sent forward his men. To support them, artillery units opened up. The idea was to hit the Allies along Route 110, along the east coast, but also to have 2 regiments go into the jungle. Again, Nara did not know exactly where the enemy was positioned. Right away, the defenders responded with their own artillery, and this would be a constant in the first part of the Battle of Bataan. The invaders were shocked by the material wealth of the enemy. Shell after shell rained down on the attackers. One after-action report of this opening engagement read, "The roar of the artillery of both sides shook the northern portion of the Bataan Peninsula. The enemy shells fell particularly furiously in the vicinity of our staging area. One shell made a direct hit on artillery HQ, and in an instant, the greater part of the staff was wiped out." Now, focusing on the fighting to the east of Mount Natib, a part of Colonel Takeo's 141st Infantry Regiment was sent into the jungle, and soon they were mixing it up with the Philippine scouts. As the Japanese troops heading down the road were getting obliterated along the Abuke line, since the Allied artillery units had had the time to map out all the roads, fields, rivers, and trails in front of them. The Allied line to the far right of Mount Natib was holding firm. Also matching this, on the 2nd Corps left flank, still right of Mount Natib in the jungle, the artillery units behind their infantrymen opened up with a cannonade that made, in Colonel Takeo's words, the blood of his men freeze with fear. Staying to the right of Natib, the two regiments of the Japanese right, Allied left, pressed forward into the jungle, supported by artillery and light tanks. The Japanese 9th and a part of the 141st Regiment moved out, going up against the Philippine 53rd and 51st Divisions. But besides the Allied artillery, there was the thick jungle to contend with, which semi-concealed the foothills of Mount Natib. When the invaders were within the thick foliage, the terrain quickly became monotonous and therefore confusing. The Japanese units quickly became separated. In fact, they spent the rest of the day fighting the enemy, looking for their comrades, all the while hoping not to be struck down by an incoming shell. Still, the brave Hohe would not stop advancing. That afternoon went by quickly, but little progress was made, and much of that was due to the terrain. That night, the face-to-face fighting fell quiet, but not the shelling. One Japanese machine gunner, a Sergeant Nakamura, would write in his diary, "An officer reconnoitering unit was sent out for the third time before night to search for the rest of the brigade. Platoon commander died in action. I am downhearted." The next day, January 10th, there was little action as the invaders, besides probing assaults, desired to wait for night. Not that this was the original plan. General Nara had wanted to hit the left side of the Allied right line hard, but General Parker's artillery again punished this effort. Nara responded by pushing more of his men to the Allied right, Japanese left, closer to Route 110. But once there, they were only to keep the defenders busy. As the light faded away, thus negating the accuracy of the Allied artillery, the 65th charged forward along the line. The two Japanese units on their right, facing the jungle, advanced and engaged with some of the Philippine Army as well as the well-trained Philippine scouts. Meanwhile, the two other Japanese regiments here, the 142nd and a different part of the 141st Regiment, pushed along Route 10, taking on the Philippine 57th and 41st Divisions. That night of January 10th, at 11 p.m., the attackers crossed a sugarcane field. Considering their fierceness and love of bayonet charges, this engaging at night was a favorite tactic of the Japanese. However, by now, it was also well known. The defenders were in well-dug foxholes, and the area before them had been organized, so each man knew his area of responsibility. The bright moon negated the Japanese from offering up a surprise attack, and when the first wave came, the bullets and shells of those dug in wiped them out. This was also the fate of the second and then third waves. By morning, there were at least 200 dead Japanese troops, littering the ground before the Philippine positions. Also on that day of January 10th, MacArthur had crossed over from Corregidor to talk with Parker and Wainwright. At one point, their conversation was cut off by an artillery attack, but the general refused to take cover. He hoped his example of courage would inspire his men. And if that was not enough, MacArthur also told his officers on the peninsula that help was on the way. The corps commanders knew this was not so, but wisely said nothing. Also on this day, General Nara sent his first demand to the Allies that they surrender. General Parker's reply to this was to have an extra round of shells sent the attackers' way. This was MacArthur's only trip to Bataan. The men of the 65th Brigade attacked again on January 11th and 12th. They were not able to overrun the defenders, but they gained ground each time at a terrible price. General Nara was told that a high percentage of his lieutenants, captains, majors, and colonels were falling in battle as they were trying to inspire their men who were, for some reason, losing their fighting spirit. After all, it had been 4 days of high losses and few supplies, considering that they were at the end of a long supply line. Nara's reply was, in today's parlance, fight smarter, not harder. Not until January 16th did a unit of the 141st Regiment finally manage to break through an enemy position on the foothills of Mount Natib. This only came about due to numerous frontal assaults, artillery barrages, and air attacks. But as the Japanese troops prepared to dash forward, as the area was now clear of Allied troops, defending artillery opened up on the entire area. The Japanese unit went no further and spent the rest of the day burying their dead. Still, this part of Parker's line on his left flank was close to breaking and being turned. Also, on January 16th, the 26th Philippine Cavalry Regiment made the last known horse-mounted charge of World War II. As the Japanese were approaching the town of Moron on the west coast, the 26th ran headlong into the enemy. Assisting the horsemen were Philippine infantry, who all together pushed the enemy back across the Bataan River. But considering the losses it took to achieve this success, the next day General Wainwright would order his forces to fall back. Not that anyone in the Empire's army would admit this, but the Japanese fighting spirit was not stronger than the enemy's mounds of bullets and shells. Still, something else, another way, was needed versus mass charges with bayonets fixed while screaming to hopefully terrify the defenders. And that something was stealth. They were called Kirikomi Tai. A leader with a 5-man team, specially trained, would head out from his own line about 1 hour before darkness. They would get to within 500 yards of the enemy's front line and spy out positions to avoid machine gun nests, trenches, and the like. Then they waited. After complete darkness, they would walk forward a ways, with rags tied around their boots for silence. Now, even closer, they would get down on their bellies and they would crawl forwards. Now closer, they would no longer crawl, but undulate their bodies, an inch forward here, then there. Once near a trench, the leader of the team would slip into the dugout, unnoticed. Approaching a Filipino who was facing the other way, the Kirikomi would whisper something in Tagalog to get the man to turn his way. At that point, a bayonet would be driven into the victim's chest. With the area around the infiltrator cleared, the team would come up and help steal supplies, and the various dispositions would be memorized to map out later for a superior. More times than not, the Kirikomi would get in and out with none the wiser, until morning, when a body or two was found. Though uncouth, it is a reality that politics is intertwined with warfare, always, which is unfair to the troops risking their lives. But politics decides who gets the best of things, i.e. the safest assignments or the best equipment and rations. For a commanding officer to wage no war in the arena of politics is to get his troops killed, one way or another. Thus, after days of losing men at an unsustainable rate, General Nara, who only days before was outwardly confident of the outcome, railed up the chain of command that his men did not have enough food, water, weapons, or replacements, which was true enough. Whether Nara knew it or not, his men, by the opening of the 3rd week of January, were digging for roots or picking wild fruit, which led to a majority of them to suffer from dysentery. Thus the 65th's attack went on. For the first 7 days, the gains had been slow, but expensive in terms of lives. And during this time, the 4 regiments, 2 along the coast road with 2 more heading into the jungle, pushed back the defenders. The Japanese 142nd and a part of the 141st pushed south along Route 110, driving back the Philippine 57th and 41st Divisions, which forced the Philippine 42nd Division in the middle of the line, so not directly engaged yet, to fall back as well, to save themselves. Soon after this, all of the defending troops on the right side of Mount Natib would head towards Route 110 along the coast, as they knew the enemy would go there. Hopefully, their numbers would mean that they would not be pushed back again. What made this breakthrough possible was Homma having Nara focus his efforts on the 2nd Philippine Corps only, and by January 22nd, the defenders were weak with a lack of food and less effective with fewer shells and bullets. So when these men were hit with continuous air attacks in between artillery barrages, the men began to fall back, no matter what General Parker did or said to motivate them. This breakthrough had been days in the making and costly to boot, but it wasn't the only success of the Japanese. As General Homma's impatience had been increasing, he decided on a rather desperate maneuver, normally not done, as it would shame one of his commanders, this being General Nara. With General Wainwright sticking firmly to his belief that the lower elevation of Mount Natib was impassable, General Homma, who sensed this, decided to exploit it. Telling General Nara to focus on the 2nd Philippine Corps only, the defensive line to the east of the height, Homma had Major General Naoki Kimura of the Kimura Detachment that had landed at Davao bring forward his men, and the 16th Division's 20th Infantry Regiment and supporting artillery. Back on January 18th, Kimura and his men moved out. Soon, they were standing opposite of Wainwright, who was not sure of this major change. Kimura sent his men ahead, and keeping most of the defensive line in front of him engaged and thus pinned down, he had some of his forces on his far left on Wainwright's right traverse the supposedly impassable foothills of the height, which allowed them to outflank the 1st Corps' right flank. The fighting was still fierce, and it took 3 days of pressure, but on January 21st, the relatively fresh 20th Regiment broke through Wainwright's line. In fact, as some of the Japanese units were able to rush west and reach the coastal road, they trapped several Philippine units behind them. Thus, a mad dash began of Wainwright's command to head south. Wainwright tried to counter this by throwing wave after wave of attacks against the Japanese roadblock, but it could not be broken. The Allies' lack of food and supplies began to tell, as the Philippines' punching power had slackened. Meanwhile, on the far Allied left, Japanese right, on the left side of Mount Natib, the Japanese regiments, the 122nd and 20th, walked through the jungle and engaged the Philippine 3rd and 1st Divisions. At first, they did not run into any serious resistance, but instead had to contend with blown bridges and mines along the well-used paths. As for those troops of Wainwright's who were still trying to hold firm, the foothills of Mount Saliganan, closer to the coast, that reached to the beaches to the west, had actually helped hide the attackers as they approached and got closer to the defenders, who were then forced back. And with the far right flank of Wainwright's line, and now his far left flank giving in, the entire line had to back away. Now, back on the first day of the fighting on the far west coast, the attackers had captured Fort Went, which is on a small island right off the coast, and then they captured the town of Olongapo, a bit north of the Allied line, and thus undefended. But it still needed to be captured to repulse any attack that might come in the future from Allied reinforcements. With this done, these forces also started coming south to help in the engagement that was crumbling Wainwright's line. Seeing that both of his corps had been penetrated, MacArthur ordered a pullback to a new defensive line during the night of January 22nd. The new line went from Bagak on the west coast to Orion on the right, roughly in the center of the peninsula. Fortunately, the territory here was a bit more narrow. As such, the defensive line would be continuous this time, which was hoped would stop the aggressors in their tracks. But even this was a temporary arrangement. During the next 2 nights, MacArthur had the majority of his troops pull back even further, though covered by 75mm guns, and General Weaver's tank group to a new line. This pullback was reported to General George Marshall, as well as that MacArthur had lost 35% of his entire force, and some divisions were operating only at 40% strength, between wounded and killed. And now the Japanese were able to focus their attacks wherever they wanted to. Basically, the Battle of Bataan had become a war of attrition. But still trying to hold on to his defense in depth, MacArthur had some of his retreating men positioned along a line that began at the Joint Security Area, roughly from a point on the west coast at Kai Bobo Point to Lomé on the east coast. Ironically, this fallback line was the pre-established line that made up the top of the Joint Security Line. Below it, both corps were responsible for defense. So as the frontline troops fell back to this line, the inferior troops, the Naval and Air Corps personnel with the Philippine Constabulary, were sent closer to the southern coast to protect that area, which is exactly where General Homma was going to strike next. Recognizing the potential for a disastrous series of attrition battles, and that the Japanese had other plums to pluck in Southeast Asia, General Homma ordered a series of amphibious landings behind not only the Bagak-Orion line, the current front, and not even behind the security area line, i.e. the second line, but along the southern coast itself between January 23rd and February 1st. History would record these amphibious assaults as the Battle of the Points. In one swift stroke, Homma was hoping to mop up Bataan and make the resistance on the island of Corregidor, including MacArthur, a moot point. Postscript. Shortly after the last cavalry charge of the U.S. military, the situation of Wainwright's crumbling command, accented with a lack of food, forced the 26th into a nightmare scenario. Needing to eat, and with the horses having eaten up their supplies with all the running they had been doing, the horses of the Philippines' 26th Cavalry Regiment were shot, prepared, and eaten by their riders. From now on, they would be infantrymen. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So, for those of you who have donated or become a member recently, I will thank you on the next episode, but I do have an important announcement. It's been brought to my attention that episode 200 is missing. It's missing from the website. It's missing from another source that I use, so I do not have it. If any of you, please, have downloaded episode 200 and you have it, could you please send me an MP3 of it to wwiipodcast@gmail.com. That way I can get it reloaded for future listeners to not have to miss out on that. So again, episode 200 is missing. I need your help. If you have it, please send me a copy to that email address. Thank you very much, and as always, take care, everyone.
When you hire your local CertaPro painters, you get the power of doing it right. Detailed project proposals, excellent customer service, and trusted professionals who get the job done on time and on budget. The power of experience. We're kings of the scaffolding and pros with the stucco. We've been there, done that. Get your project started at CertaPro.com and get the power of pro.
Each CertaPro painter's business is independently owned and operated.